On the 3rd of May, 1899, Wilbur Wright wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, asking for information on the proper construction of flying machines so as to, quote, avail myself of all that is already known. The Wright brothers acknowledged their debt to Cayley on numerous occasions. Wilbur Wright wrote of the ingenious calculations of Sir George Cayley, and in 1909 that Cayley carried the science of flying to a point which it had never reached before and which it scarcely reached again during last century. And Orville Wright wrote in 1912, Sir George Cayley was a remarkable man. He knew more about the principles of aviation than any of his predecessors, and as much as any that followed him up to the end of the 19th century. His published work is remarkably free from error and was a most important contribution to the science. And in their conversations with aviation pioneers, such as Chanute, they engage in detailed discussion of Cayley's calculations. In this talk, I seek to highlight some, and I do emphasize some, of Cayley's key contributions to aviation, and to give a sense of his investigative and experimental procedures, to consider some of his other inventions, experiments, and engineering ideas, to place him within his intellectual and scientific milieu, to consider his role as a public figure in local and national politics, his contribution to the founding of the Royal Polytechnic institution in Regent Street, to the spread of knowledge and new ideas, to an increasingly educated and in part newly enfranchised public. George Cayley was born in 1773. The most famous image of him is that portrait by Henry Perronet Briggs in the National Portrait Gallery, showing Cayley in 1840, in his late 60s. His father was the 6th Baronet Cayley. The family estate was based at Brompton, near Scarborough in Yorkshire. The dominant influence on Cayley's early life was his mother Isabella, a person of independent thought and sympathetic to nonconformity. His early education is unclear, but in 1891 he became a pupil of George Walker at Nottingham. Walker was a Unitarian minister of radical sympathies, a mathematician and a fellow of the Royal Society, and president of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, and a friend of Joseph Priestley. Under Walker as a tutor, Cayley was introduced to leading mathematic scientific ideas, to ideas in navigation and in mechanics, and to the debates of the day as they were being developed through the growing importance of learned societies. He also learnt the importance of practical experiment and attention to materials through his work in Walker's workshop. Walker also believed in the education of women, and his daughter Sarah shared classes with the male pupils, and Cayley was to fall in love with her. In 1792, Cayley was placed under a new tutor, George Cadogan Morgan, at Southgate in London. Morgan was also a Unitarian minister and a scientist, and published 2 volumes of lectures on electricity. He was a political radical, supporting the American independence, and witnessed the fall of the Bastille. Under Morgan's influence, Cayley moved in London reform circles, attending meetings at one of the centre of radical debates, the Crown and Anchor Tavern just off the Strand, where he met Major John Cartwright, known as the father of reform and an advocate of universal suffrage. In the midst of all this study, Cayley's father died, and so George inherited the baronetcy. At the age of 18, he was, however, still, in financial terms, a minor. As a gesture of revolutionary zeal, he at first declined to use his title, but like many others, his radicalism was moderated by the news of the excesses of the terror. In 1795, he married Sarah Walker, daughter of his first tutor. There were 10 children, a large family, and by all accounts, the family relationships were affectionate and volatile. Cayley's vision of aerial navigation is found in his notebooks and in his published works. He talks about a vast, navigable, uninterrupted universe, which can be brought to man's good use. At Brompton, he set up workshops and carried out his experiments in Brompton Vale. These are pictures of Vale. This is a picture of Cayley's workshop. In 1799, he engraved a small silver disc, now in the collection of the Science Museum in London, and only discovered, in fact, in 1935, in which he illustrated some of the key concepts which will inform his subsequent inquiries and experiments. This is the much enlarged version of the disc. On one side of the disc, we have the image of a monoplane with fixed cambered wing and a bolt-shaped fuselage and a tail. This configuration is seen by many as a blueprint for the idea of a sustainable winged flight. On the reverse is a diagram indicating the forces of drag and thrust which operate on a lifting surface. In his 1804 notebook, Cayley includes a design for an experimental glider, first of many. This is probably the basic design for what Cayley himself termed a flying parachute. He never uses the term glider, nor does he ever use the term glide. He uses the word skim instead, extensively, in his study of bird flight. And this was developed into a series of later machines. These gliders were in part the result of a series of measurements and calculations gathered through the use of a whirling arm, which Cayley devised. This is the drawing from his notebook of the whirling arm, which is about 5 foot long, and here we see it in an historical reconstruction. Lawrence Pritchard, in perhaps the first really serious study of Cayley's work, or one of the first along with Charles Gibbs Smith, writes, "The systematic measurement of pressure on surfaces at different angles to the air stream, so essential to the extensive and complicated aerodynamics for flying, these were the first to be made, as far as we know." So Cayley is seen by many, not only now, but in his own lifetime, as really instigating the first serious and systematic program of aviation research. But these ideas of circular motion, which came from the whirling arm, had to be tested against the straight line motion of flying machines, hence the work with the gliders. And we begin to see here something that is very characteristic of all of Cayley's work, the matching of calculation and practical experimentation. Cayley's research included also a very detailed study of bird flight. He writes, "I have weighed and measured the surface of a great many birds, but at present shall select the common rook, because its surface and weight are nearly as possible in the ratio of a superficial foot to the pound. The flight of this bird, during any part of which they can skim at pleasure, from an average of many observations, is about 34.5 feet per second. The concavity of the wing may account for the greater resistance here received than the experiments upon plane surfaces would indicate. I'm convinced that the angle made use of in the crow's wing is much more acute than 6 degrees, but I may safely say that every foot of such curved surface as will be used in aerial navigation will receive a resistance of 1 pound perpendicular to itself when carried through the air in an angle of 6 degrees, with a line of its path at a velocity of about 34 to 35 feet per second. And it gets more complicated than that. But it gives you a sense of the precision of Cayley's observation leading into calculation, and then we will see it also being demonstrated in his experimental range of experimental machines. The studies here led Cayley to question some of the orthodoxies of the day regarding flying, particularly the notion of the ornithoptic model of flapping as being the main means by which birds fly, and therefore which could be mimicked in some form by humans. So the mimicking of flapping, he argues, is actually not borne out by our study of birds and the comparison of bird power and bird muscular power to that of humans. And the emphasis on the notion of gliding and skimming is very important in these calculations. He also carries out studies to explore the importance of an inclined plane in dealing with the resistance of air. These natural mechanics, as they would have been called at the time, also included study and analysis of the movement of fish, such as trout and dolphin. Cayley at this time is also becoming increasingly aware of the necessity for a powered engine. And we find the first of such proposals here in his notebooks. I'll come back to this one in a moment, of a gunpowder engine. And then he moves on to studies of hot air engines, which becomes, in fact, a preoccupation throughout the rest of his life. He's also interested in the building of a carriage wheel for the wheels for the undercarriage of a flying machine. And the question of lightness is absolutely central to these investigations, not only in the engine, but in all the component parts of a viable flyer. This is the proposal for a tension wheel, and he says of this in the notebook of 1808. In thinking how to construct the lightest possible wheel for aerial navigation cars, an entirely new mode of manufacturing this most useful part of all locomotive machines has occurred to me. To do away with wooden spokes altogether, and to refer the whole firmness of the wheel to the strength of the rim only, by the intervention of tight, strong cording. Such a wheel would, I am confident, be almost everlasting of light travelling vehicles, would be very beautiful, given no shake and therefore require much slender axle trees and have less friction. I don't know, and I think it unlikely that the Wright brothers ever knew of this particular piece of work, but there is a nice anticipation here, both in the functional and the aesthetic components of a tension wheel to the work that they were to undertake in the light of their bicycle experiments. The first of the tripartite papers, published between 1809 and 1810, are, in a sense, encapsulate the whole range of Cayley's experiments and observations up to this point. The first paper, published in Nicholson's Journal of Chemistry, Science, the Arts in November 1809, begins by establishing Cayley's exploration of systems for lift and propulsion for humans. And the importance of lightness again. Interestingly, on the news recently, we've seen the material regarding the new Boeing 787 Dreamliner, which again emphasizes the idea of lightness and, of course, contemporary concerns with saving fuel and fuel emissions. He writes in the paper about bird flight. He says, "The idea that we could make men fly by attaching wings to the arms of a man is ridiculous enough, as the pectoral muscles of a bird occupy more than 2/3 of its whole muscular strength, whereas in man the muscles that could operate upon wings thus attached would probably not exceed 1/10 of his whole mass. There is no proof that weight for weight a man is comparatively weaker than a bird. It is therefore probable it can be made to exert his whole strength advantageously upon a light surface, similarly proportioned to his weight as that of the wing of the bird, so that he would fly like the bird, and therefore achieve propulsion and sustained flight. The flight of a strong man by greater muscular exertion through a curious and intervening circumstances is as much as would probably be the first means of ascertaining this power and supplying the basis whereupon to approve it. It would be of little use." In other words, what we have to find is a first mover and to separate the process of lift from the process of propulsion. To produce this effect, it is only necessary to have a first mover which will generate more power in a given time in proportion to its weight than the animal system of muscles. He says, lightness is of much value in this instance. And again, he continues analyzing bird flight. I shall in the first instance analyze the most simple action of the wing in birds, although it necessarily supposes many previous steps. When large birds that have a considerable extent of wing compared with their weight have acquired their full velocity, it may frequently be observed that they extend their wings and, without waving them, continue to skim, we would say glide, continue to skim for some time in a horizontal path. This is one of the diagrams from the paper showing a bird flying as Cayley has here described. And in this paper, he also formulates his sort of classic definition, or what is seen as a classic definition of the problem of flight. The whole problem is confined within these limits. That is, to make a surface support a given weight by the application of power to the resistance of air. Very compressed statement, but one which identifies many of the very key aspects of the conceptualization of the idea of flight. The whole problem is confined within these limits. To make a surface support a given weight by the application of power to the resistance of air. And he then engages in the question of, or he engages in the question of the concave wing. The flight of birds will prove to an attentive reader that with a concave wing apparently parallel to the horizontal path of the bird, the same support and resistance is obtained. And hence I am inclined to suspect that under extremely acute angles, with concave surfaces, the resistance is nearly similar in them all. I conceive the operation may be of a different nature from what takes place at larger angles, and may partake more of the principle of pressure exhibited in the instrument known by the name of the hydroglacic paradox. A slender filament of the current is constantly received under the interior edge of the surface and directed upwards into the cavity by the filament above it, it being obliged to mount along the conductivity of its surface, having created a slight vacuity immediately behind the point of separation. And the fluid accumulated thus within the cavity has to make its escape at the posterior edge. So you're getting here a configuration of the forces that are operating in order to sustain flight. So we have then this separation of the component parts of flight, and then the discussion of how birds in flight can inform the mechanics of man-made flight and man-made machines. Cayley is aware, however, that he and his contemporaries are at the beginning of a very long and complex process, because he says in this paper, quote, "Every man acquainted with experiments upon a large scale will well knows how leisurely fact follows theory." Every man acquainted with experiments from a large scale will know how leisurely fact follows theory. So he's giving himself some leeway, some time to get there. He also, in the paper, refers to this diagram of a whirling cork-made helicopter, which he says was actually his first experiment in the field of aviation, done in 1796, and it's based, of course, on French model of a French helicopter toy that had been developed about 10 years earlier. So we're at the beginning then of a long process, and for Cayley himself, it's going to be a process that goes on for many years indeed. Tom Crouch from the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian, in his book Wings, summarizes Cayley's achievements as follows, or his achievements in the tripartite papers. They are to confirm earlier suggestions that a curved or cambered wing produces greater lift than a flat plate set at a low angle of attack, identifies an area of low pressure on the upper surface of a cambered wing in flight and an area of high pressure on the underside, suggests that angling the tips of the wings above the center line of the aircraft, creating a dihedral angle, will produce a measure of lateral stability. In other words, dihedral configuration is one in which the wings are angled like this, the tips of the wings are at a higher point at which the wings meet the fuselage. His work provides the earliest studies on the movement of the center of pressure on aeroplane wings under flight, and explains how to calculate the performance of a flying machine. In the coming years, Cayley continued his studies, developed his glider designs and proposals for airships and related inventions. Among his chief concerns was the question of power, how to develop a steam or a hot air engine. And in this, he's in constant correspondence with many other inventors of the field at the time. In 1843, he published discussion of an aerial carriage, which draws on the ideas of the American C. Taylor. And some controversy surrounds Cayley's lack of attribution to Taylor on this matter. In his middle years, Cayley was increasingly involved in public affairs and in inventions, many of them involving safety issues arising from the rapid advances in technology. And it's actually not really until the period in the late 1880s, when Cayley is in his 70s, that he returns to the intensive program of theoretical and practical activity that we see in the period between roughly 1800 and 1810. Cayley's work in these intervening years shows the same sense of dedication and determination which we find throughout his aviation. Cayley took very seriously his duties as a landlord, and throughout his life was engaged in questions of agricultural reform and the well-being of his tenants, particularly when affected by economic crises. In 1779, there was extensive flooding caused by the overflow of the Derwent and Harford rivers, which affected a large area, some 10,000 acres or so, around Muston and Cayley's estate. And Cayley, with others, presented a petition to Parliament for an act for drainage, embanking and preserving divers tracts of land within the township of Muston. On the passing of the Muston Drainage Act, Cayley became the chairman of the directors of the Muston Drainage Scheme and held this post until his death. He also instituted a series of agricultural allotments in his estates, and he returned at other later points in his life to the question of drainage and of flooding, and including one of his very last papers, written shortly before his death, a paper published on the recent inundations in France, flooding in the area around the Loire. Many other inventions than those in aviation are carried out during this time. Back in 1809, he had published. Oh yes, this is just an example of his studies of dolphins, showing how he's applying the same observation and calculation in terms of natural mechanics to fish life as to birds. We'll come to that in a moment. He publishes proposals for the rebuilding of Covent Garden Theatre, the precursor of the Royal Opera House, which had been destroyed by fire the previous year. His designs aimed at improving the audience's visual and auditory experience, and many safety suggestions: the introduction of a fire curtain and easy access to main and emergency exits. And in 1856, nearly 40 years later, that paper was reprinted after a second fire at Covent Garden. In 1825, he published his proposals in that's the Covent Garden study, in the Mechanics magazine for what he called a universal railway, a forerunner of the Caterpillar tractor. 1830, he witnessed the accident at the opening of the Manchester to Liverpool Railway, which resulted in the death of the politician William Hutchinson. And he began proposing suggestions for railway safety, particularly relating to buffers and brake systems. And he was particularly engaged with the issues involved on the loading and unloading of passengers and goods. Argued, for instance, for the universal introduction of separate rail systems. And he protested vigorously at the iniquity of placing second-class carriage passengers in the rear, the most dangerous part of the trains. He says of this, "Let me add that the present method of placing second or third-class carriages on the rear to serve by being smashed up with the bones of their passengers as buffers to those in first class is most disgraceful and inhuman." But there are really quite a substantial body of papers that deal with these issues. Just going back to that's the Caterpillar tractor. I put that up because I think it shows rather nicely the relationship between the finished, as it were, drawing for publication, and Cayley's notebooks. And there's something about the notebooks that is very alive, that in a sense is, even in the clarification that you get in the printed form, there's some sense of loss. And of course, one of the big problems, I think, for Cayley's studies and for talking about Cayley's influence was that the notebooks didn't become known until into the 20th century. And it's interesting to speculate what would have happened if the notebooks had been published in his lifetime or shortly after his death, and whether the combination of published works and notebooks would have led to other advances in aviation theory and practice. There are some of the examples of Buffer, his Buffer proposals for railway engines. In 1845, Cayley published an account of an artificial hand, a prosthetic hand, he invented for George Cayley, who was the son of one of his tenants, who'd lost his right hand back in 1839, but the stump of the hand was too raw for some time to have any attachment to it. In fact, the hand is not attached to the stump. It is attached to higher on the arm. So effectively, you have like you have 2.5 arms if you wear this. So the hand is strapped to the upper part of the limb affected. For lightness, it's packed with cork. But while it had little flexibility, it had fairly considerable lifting capacity. Apparently, you could lift a weight of up to 70 pounds with the use of the hand. Cayley was brought to London, and Cayley and the hand were demonstrated widely, including at the Royal Polytechnic Institution and at a soiree held by Lord Northampton, the then president of the Royal Society, present at which were Prince Albert and the Duke of Wellington. And I think there's an interesting link between this and many of Cayley's experiments, particularly this, with the metalwork that he himself learned in Walker's workshop, and which he was developing in his own workshop in Brompton. Cayley apparently became eventually disillusioned with being what he described as a freak or a spectacle, and left the hand one day and went back home. But Cayley published adaptations on the hand for some time. Cayley's Circle by this time is a very large one. He is at the center of many of the important scientific and technological debates of the time. And many of the eminent scientists and inventors and public figures are part of that circle. They include Prince Albert, John Dalton, Sir Humphrey Davy, Charles Babbage, George and Robert Stephenson of railway and bridge fame, John Rennie, again bridge builder, Dr. Peter Mark Roget, for a while secretary to the Royal Society, and of course most famous for his authorship of the Thesaurus, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who as vice chairman of the Institute of Engineers chaired a meeting on Cayley's hot air engine in 1850. And he also visited France on 2 or 3 occasions, one particularly a Paris trip in 1827, and was in regular correspondence with French scientists. He was active in local and national political life. Back in 1807, he supported Wilberforce in the York elections and continued to be a strong supporter of the anti-slavery movement. He became a member of the Whig Party, and his politics are interesting. His early radicalism had given way to a gradualist position regarding reform, opposing both the idea of universal suffrage, given the uneducated state of the majority of the population, while at the same time attacking the continuance of inherited privilege. He was to become the chairman of the Whig Club in York, and in 1821 he helped form the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. And as vice president of that society, he played a very important role in the founding of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1831. He had also earlier on engaged with his old friend from London, Major John Cartwright, and he published a paper on parliamentary reform, paper addressed to Cartwright. We had that earlier, in which he lays out a gradualist position. He's prepared to say in the paper, perhaps one day the day for universal suffrage will come, perhaps even for republicanism, but it's not. But it's not now. And he has a very strong sense of the social order has to be kept, in a sense, in balance. And we find another expression of this in a curious incident in 1816. Cayley's mother had become a fervent Methodist, and Cayley was opposed to the establishment of Methodism, a Methodist chapel on his land, on his estate. He's away from Brompton. He comes back and finds, to his great annoyance, that his mother has been instrumental with others in buying land on which to build a chapel. And an extraordinarily sort of ritualized debate takes place, antagonistic debate takes place between himself and his mother. And he posts up his position publicly on this. He says, "I admit a full right for the individual judgment in matters in religion, and I have no objection to my tenants professing whatever religion they please, provided it does not prevent that wholesome and natural dependence of one rank of society upon another, which has hitherto so firmly sustained the fabric of British strength and raised it to the first class among nations. It is the leading fault in your doctrine," this is addressing the local Methodists, "that it tends to undermine this natural compact between the higher and the lower ranks in society." I think also there's a sense here in which this may seem surprising given his upbringing, given the fact that he's been tutored by Unitarian ministers, indeed in marrying Sarah Walker, has married into a Unitarian family. But I think also for Cayley it's not just simply that he sees a natural sympathy between the social order and the established Anglican Church, but also Methodism, with its enthusiasm and its evangelical fervour, would have been quite antagonistic to the sort of rationalist deism that he discovered in Unitarianism. So Cayley's position represents somewhere it slides along the spectrum of Whiggery and reformist politics in this period. In 1832, Cayley stood as Member of Parliament and was elected successfully to the constituency as MP for Scarborough. The second portrait that we find of Cayley in the National Portrait Gallery in London is his presence in the enormous painting by Sir George Hayter of the Reformed House of Parliament. Cayley's, I don't have a slide of that, but Cayley standing up in the balcony in the top left-hand corner of the Hayter portrait. He also at this time gained a London residence, 20 Hertford Street, just off Park Lane, and interestingly, just round the corner from the headquarters now of the Royal Aeronautical Society. His parliamentary work was not extensive. He presented a petition from the ship owners of Scarborough to Parliament and supported Goldsworthy Gurney, the inventor who was developing the idea of steam-powered carriageways on the roads, in his attempt to have the tolls on steam vehicles lifted, which were strongly opposed by the horse-drawn carriage lobby, and Cayley was unsuccessful in achieving a lifting of the toll for Gurney. It's rather interesting, and it's a sort of a counterpoint to what I was saying about the reply to Cartwright and the Methodism issue, that in his speech standing as a member for Scarborough, Cayley uses, as part of his credentials, his early radicalism. This is what he says: "My manhood was coeval with the great European struggle," that's the French Revolution, "before the French Revolution assumed its savage form. I used to attend the meetings in London at the Crown and Anchor Tavern, where I met most of the leading Whigs of the day. Here I became acquainted with Tooke, Major Cartwright, and others, and they gave me a first and lasting impulse towards reform." Cayley, however, withdrew his candidacy for the election of 1835, and that was effectively ending his direct parliamentary career. In 1837, Cayley, in association with Charles Payne, the manager of the Adelaide Gallery in London, and a speculative builder, William Nurse, formulated a plan to open a gallery in Regent Street. A prospectus signed by Cayley as chairman of the Provisional Committee was issued for an institution for the advancement of arts and practical sciences in Cavendish Square and Regent Street. The prospectus begins, "It has been deemed desirable by many persons, friendly to science, to establish in the western part of London an institution where the public, at little expense, may acquire by means of a laboratory, experiment rooms and a gallery for the exhibition of novel inventions, a practical knowledge of the various arts and branches of science connected with manufactures, mining operations, and rural economy. The premises as a whole will thus, at a moderate subscription, combine the advantage of a laboratory and experiment rooms and a gallery for the illustration of science and art, together with a convenient place of social resort for the lovers of practical science, as well as the inhabitants of the neighbourhood, as to visitors from the provinces and colonies and foreign parts, while the premises fronting Regent Street will be open without interference to the house." So we're having a slight demarcation here between a more sort of gentleman's club idea and one open to the general public. Something which in the reality of the Polytechnic didn't happen, for a small sum to be paid on entry. And he says that this undertaking is to be modelled on the advantages of the French École Centrale. So he's using a French model and his links to France. Again, a sort of an Enlightenment concept. You can see him appealing to different audiences, different constituencies in this prospectus. And it ends, "A provisional committee has been appointed to carry out the above views into execution. This committee, however, is composed of gentlemen favourable to such an institution on public grounds alone, being totally unconnected with the pecuniary side of the undertaking." And of course, needless to say, in reality, there were tensions between the philosophical and the pecuniary aspects of the institution. The institution opened in beginning of September 1838, and Cayley became and remained until his death its chairman. We have here this is the first image of the building from the magazine of the Mirror of Literature, Amusement and Instruction. The Polytechnic represents itself as dedicated to demonstrating by the most simple and interesting methods of illustration the sound and important principles on which every science is based and the processes employed in the most useful arts and manufactures effected. This is an image a little later when the institution has acquired the title of the Royal Polytechnic Institution. And here we have a lantern slide showing the part of the interior, the great hall with its various demonstrations. The interior consisted of several component parts: a hall of manufactures, a great hall with canals and inventions. We'll come to some of those in a moment. A first floor lecture theatre and laboratories and other spaces for classes and smaller meetings. This is the lantern slide, which is in the archives of the University of Westminster now, somewhat distorted, but gives you a sense of scale. This is another more perspective image, and you'll notice here in the middle of the image is the diving bell. The diving bell was one of the most publicized and most popular of the activities that took place. The Adelaide Gallery had a diving bell, and in which a mouse was submerged. The Polytechnic had a diving bell in which 6 humans could be submerged. So the Adelaide Gallery was clearly trumped on this one. There was also a diver who would dive down, and the interest here, I think, in both the diving bell and the diver is, of course, this is the time in which the Thames Tunnel is being led, in which the sewers in London are being led, in which London is being dug up. And this digging up of London at the time is brilliantly recorded in the work of the artist George Scharf, who every day, as he goes to the British Museum to do his lithographic and mezzotint work on geological samples, records the digging up of London. The philosophy of the Polytechnic is nicely encapsulated in the perspective of 1844, which talks about the education of the eye. The education of the eye is undeniably the most important object in elementary instruction. A child will pass many years before he can be made thoroughly to understand, by unassisted description, the cause of motion in the steam engine, but a brief acquaintance with the sectional and working models of the institution will teach him a lesson he can never forget. And so we go through a list of inventions, new ideas, things that are new patents that are being demonstrated and advertised. So the education of the eye sets the institution within tradition that is to lead to the establishment of the South Kensington Museums. Another later more detailed description of the Great Hall, and here giving you a sense of the scale, the size of the diving bell. Cayley's day-to-day relationship with the Polytechnic can be quite sporadic, but there were certain things that did fit in very much with his interests, particularly the demonstration of Green's balloon, Green the transatlantic balloonist, or aspirant transatlantic balloonist. But here you see a bill of fare from Green's balloon, the diving bell, to the microscope. And here, again, as under a suggestion of Cayley's, is a demonstration from the early 1850s of Foucault's pendulum. One of the major new technologies, new inventions, for which the Polytechnic became famous was the new discovery of photography, and initially of the daguerreotype portraiture. Henry Fox Talbot demonstrated his patent work at the institution, and here Beard, the portrait photographer, has set up studio, one of, if not the first, one of the first photographic studios in Europe. In 1848, a large theatre is built, and this allows for the development of massive projections and the development of lantern slides, for which the institution was to become nationally and internationally famous. This shows one of these, and associated very much with this, the optical spectacle, was Professor, as he was named, Henry Pepper, who became the head of the educational work at the Polytechnic and effectively its director. Pepper is best known for his famous invention, Pepper's Ghost. Here we see it at the top. But he also published numbers of important books popularizing science, which were known internationally. And in fact, it was very much under Pepper's influence that the institution began to develop in the mid-1850s its educational work in relationship to the introduction of examinations by the Royal Society of Arts in 1856. And this shows us a spectrum analysis, one of the more, you might say, academic uses of the new technologies. And this is the prospectus, or a prospectus, for the institution in the first term at which it is working alongside the Royal Society of Arts. And this tradition, developing through lantern slides, was to develop later in the 19th century to film. And in the university's building at 309 Regent Street, we have the site where the Lumiere brothers first presented film in 1996. In the last years of his life, the end of the 1840s, Cayley returns to a program of intensive aviation work. He gathers together a team around him, consisting of his son and his engineering assistant, Thomas Vick, and they produce a number of new machines. Two of these, known as the boy carrier and the Coachman carrier, are often seen as the first planes carrying a human pilot. Cayley himself describes the effect of what's called the boy carrier, going for a very short flight, he says the balance and steerage was ascertained, and a boy of about 10 years of age was floated off the ground for several yards on descending a hill, and also for about the same distance by some persons pulling the apparatus against a very slight breeze. This is Cayley at the time, a daguerreotype portrait. Well, nice to think that we don't know that it was actually taken in Regent Street. And this is a paper he published in the Mechanics magazine, one of his last papers on aviation, on the idea of a governable, what he called a governable parachute. And that's a sort of composite of some of his machines, from early gliders, going from 1804 to right up to the one I'll be talking about in a moment to finish with in 1850, in the early 1850s, to possibly the boy carrier and to the governable parachute. We have Cayley's report of the boy carrier. More problematically, we have this machine. This is the famous Coachman from the Anglia television program of 1972, Reconstruction. Another shot from that film, and this the photograph of the reconstruction that was made for the IMAX film in Washington, film called On the Wing. We'll just hold that one for a moment. The Coachman story is well known, and its status is problematic. It's a very good story. It ends with a great line where the coachman says, "I was hired, to be a coachman and not to fly." We don't have a record by Cayley himself of it. We have records that are made many years later, and so that there may be an element of legend about this. On the other hand, there seems no reason to argue that it didn't take place. And the fact that reconstructions made of it have also flown. These reconstructions that I've shown seem to show its viability. It has then this sort of status as being the first man-carrying, man-piloted flight, though without a powered engine. The reconstructions took place under the guidance of Commander John Sproule, for the Anglia film, and then for the IMAX film, and Sproule uses as the basis of his evidence Cayley's notebooks, the published designs such as the parachute, the governable parachute, and a certain amount of imaginative guesswork, putting the ideas together, and working very carefully with technicians to achieve these flights that are now recorded. And subsequently, there have been other attempts to fly. 2003, Richard Branson took to one of these machines. Yeah, okay. What I want to look at is this, not this machine, but this comes from the last article that Cayley wrote, sent to the French Aerostatic Society. He tried for a number of years to get an aviation society started in England. His last serious attempt was in 1840, hoping to piggyback, in a sense, on the popularity of Green in London and the Green's lectures at the Polytechnic, but these were unsuccessful. But the French had organized their aeronautic work, and Cayley wrote to them, showing them this design, which I like particularly for the lovely drawing of the two little feet in the bottom one, but also for a design which was known as the riding rudder design. This is it, the last of his gliders, his hand gliders, which you see here on the top. And under John Sprule's, under Sproule, this was made for the Anglia film, and then at the Polytechnic of Central London, as we were, and again as the University of Westminster in 2003-04, we made a replica of this machine in the architecture workshops at the university. Cayley describes the design. The sail is 6 feet 2 inches long by 4 feet 3 inches wide, sewn on flat oval yards, 6 feet long and erect and elevated 1 foot 4 inches above the shaft, 12 feet long. Again, very, very precise description. The horizontal rudder for side steerage contains 2 square feet. There's a curved pry of iron to ease the shock when it alights on the ground, and this weight being screwed to the shaft on a greater or less distance from the center of the ground, and the weight being screwed to that shaft at a greater or lesser distance from the center of support, enables the center of gravity to be placed as much in advance of that point as is found requisite to give the proper inclination by the descent of this sort of parachute. The whole appropriates to 16 pounds. These are some slides showing the building of the glider in the workshop at the Architecture School of the University. And this, in its point of being constructed, this is it being almost finished, same slide, and that's it being shown in the foyer of the Regent Street building. It's the site of Cayley's original Polytechnic. And here it's being shown, and in this slide, at the RAF Museum in Hendon, where it's still on display after the exhibition that we put on there. And this is Dr. Peter Jacob from the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum conducting a school's workshop underneath the glider. And it's generally seen, the glider, as one of the most, among other things, elegant of Cayley's designs. Cayley's position in aviation history is one that raises many questions, many perhaps and ifs. Was he ahead of his time? If you read his obituary in the Times in the 18th of December, 1857, there's no mention hardly of his flight work at all. There's some mention of balloons. There's a lot of mention about hot engines, a lot of mentions about his public world. He's in a sense against the grain. He's known among a group of scientists and inventors. So perhaps he's just ahead of his time, and this explains why his advances were not made more quickly. Perhaps some critics say if he'd paid more attention to the use of propellers, perhaps if he'd been successful in getting an aeronautics society, he would have then gathered around him a group of like-minded people. Perhaps if his notebooks had been available as well as his published papers, this would have advanced aviation research. Most of all, perhaps if someone had come up with a feasible light engine, then things would have been very different. There's another perhaps, which is perhaps if it hadn't been for Cayley and his work, and that means particularly his published work, the tripartite papers, his other publications, perhaps if Cayley hadn't done this, then it would have taken even longer for the success of aviation to be achieved. In a sense, we're dealing here, I think, with perhaps a conflict, not necessarily a conflict, but a tension between two accounts of aviation and science, what you might call the eureka idea, that there are these moments of discovery, and the idea of it being a question of process. Peter Jacob from Air and Space writes neatly on this regarding the Wright brothers. He said the Wright brothers understood that an aeroplane was not just one invention, but numerous inventions, all working in concert to produce a final result. There's two things I think that most characterize Cayley's work. One is this interplay between observation, calculation, and experiment. And the second, I think, is what I can best describe as, over 50 years, a real sense of intellectual and creative tenacity. Thank you very much.